All right, so trauma assessments. There's a new algorithm for this, been out for a long time actually. It's considered new, it's probably 15 years old. Seen to use more originally. This is a one from the war, and then it became a part of TCCC. You're familiar with that? What used to be Combat Lifesaver, then TCCC, and now it's TECC is the one that we use. If you've taken that class, which they have up here like once a year now, that Bill Justice did up here, you've seen this. If not, it's kind of new, but it's just a different way. So the old way, right, we always did ABC, and then with trauma, trauma and cardiac arrest, we reversed that to CAB, and then they came up with this, which addresses better. You still cover everything, but there's things in here that you don't think about, and they get kind of forgotten. But so why did they do that? They took the data from the war, from Iraq, Afghanistan, and they looked at which is where the most trauma was coming from at the time. Obviously, you have about 60,000 cases of priority 1 trauma in like an 8-year period, and they looked through it. They did a study during one of the battles of Fallujah about tourniquets, and they used those numbers, and that study became one of the reasons why we were able to get tourniquets on the truck all the time, in particular the CAT tourniquet, and then a couple more studies. They looked at these numbers, and they said, what actually kills people in trauma, and then how do we address that? And if you put all your effort towards the biggest killers, you'll get the most saves, basically. So the March algorithm, easy to remember, and it addresses that. And it's a better way to do the trauma assessment. It's faster. To me, it's more organized. We'll talk it through, and then I'll show you guys with a volunteer kind of how it's done, the physical skills of it. But so the M is massive bleeding. Number 1 killer in trauma, if left untreated. The way we treat massive bleeding, we were talking about an assessment first. We're gonna the first initial assessment is mostly visual. Your is a visual assessment, head to toe, and I like March because it goes in that order. Head to toe assessment of what's going on, walk up. It doesn't matter whether it's a gunshot wound, a car wreck, or an elderly fall. Trauma's trauma, right? The same things kill people in trauma. So it's just an initial walk up, quick assessment. Before we leave the scene, we have to address our initial things where the person will die the majority of the time, or they will be severely injured. So visually, we're looking for massive bleeding. That generally is blood on the ground, their clothes are soaked in blood, etc. So we don't have a demonstration here, but I usually pour it out. This is 12 ounces of Red Bull. If I was to pour this on the floor, it'll make a pretty big circle. That is not a lot of blood. This wouldn't bother anybody in this room. Okay, so establishing what a large amount of blood is, like a liter or more is a lot of blood. So double this. But Mickey and I had one of the day. You walk in right away. Oh, we were on the two-bed. You walk in right away and you're like, oh my God. And there's a like car size, probably area of blood. That obviously is a lot of blood. Yeah. Something to be worried about. So deal with massive bleeding. Anytime you find it, you have to deal with it. It doesn't matter whether it's an arterial bleed or a venous bleed. You can die for both. They will both kill you. We used to only think of tourniquets for arteries, like spurting blood. That's not true. If it's a lot of blood and it's on an extremity, just put a tourniquet on it. They're that safe. So next is, we're looking for head to toe visually. Any massive bleeding from head to toe, fix it immediately. Next is our airway. Generally, you can deal with that by just asking the person, hey, how are you doing? If they can talk to you, they're breathing, right? If they're unconscious, that's something that we have to address. Just by opening their airway, suctioning their airway, simple as turning their head and wiping their mouth out or putting them in the proper head position whenever you, before you move them, is enough early on, right? Respiration is next. Are they breathing or are they not breathing? If they're unconscious, you may put your hand on their chest to feel it, but are they breathing or are they not breathing? And on the initial assessment, that's all you want to know. If they're breathing very quickly or very slowly, I note that and I'll deal with that in a minute. And then checking a pulse, which can be done at the same time as I'm looking at their chest. I'm checking the radial pulse. Do they have a radial pulse? If they do, their blood pressure is at least 80, and I'm okay with it. on the initial assessment. I don't have anything to worry about right now. They have a radial pulse, so their blood pressure 80 or above. We're okay with that. If you remember permissive hypotension that we do now, we allow 90 or above. So if they have a strong radial pulse, they're in that 90 range, and we're good with it. We move on. And then last is head injuries or hypothermia. All this is on the initial assessment is realizing that. Do they have some type of head injury? I can look at that by look at their eyeballs very quickly, obvious injuries to their head, and then are they outside laying in water, or is it, even if it's 65, but we're on the side of the highway and they've lost a good amount of blood and the wind's blowing 20 miles an hour, they're hypothermic. Because for every, I can't remember the exact numbers on it, but every 12 ounces of blood or so you lose, your temperature starts to drop. Because they were giving blood, the Red Cross, you shiver right away, right? Because you're losing your ability to maintain heat through your blood. And we talked about that not too long ago in fluids, why we don't, fluid resuscitation just a couple months ago. That's one of the reasons why we don't overload fluids, because we'll make them hypothermic. So initial assessment visually, all those things need to happen, and then we leave the scene. So if you run up, throw the person onto a backboard, put them on the cot, and then leave, you didn't do any of those things, and that person will probably die. Statistically proven that's the way it's going to happen. Okay? So we also learned from spinal motion restriction earlier this month that we don't really use backboards that much anymore. We should not be transporting backboards. People on backboards all the way to Tulsa, unless really ever, but unless they have a known spinal injury and we know they're paralyzed, that's about the only time. And then it's still iffy on whether that's good for or bad for them. Once you, so you do your initial and move them, what's a better way? Better way is a mega mover, a blanket, a scoop stretcher, anything that has a little bit more flexibility to it and it's easier to maneuver. Kind of scoop stretcher is probably, if you want to use a hard board, the scoop stretcher is best because it has better handles on it. It's shaped better than a backboard is. Blanket probably second best, mega mover probably the best because it has handles, it's meant to do it, it's meant to fit on the cot. It allows the person to bend at the waist, which makes it easier for you to work on with the truck. Makes them easier to get on and off the cot. Remember, we don't need a backboard to do CPR if the person to rest because there's a built-in backboard on the cot. It has a metal plate below it. So we don't have to have a backboard on it. That's super old school and they didn't have that. We don't have to do that anymore. So backboards make things a lot harder on you. Okay. So now we got our initial assessment or our secondary assessment, which is more detailed. So maybe we put a tourniquet on and we stopped some massive bleeding, or we adjusted their airway. We realized their respirations are not good. They don't have a radial pulse, and we're unsure about this stuff. So we did that initial. Now we need to go to priority 1 to a trauma center. So then we immediately leave. This takes like a minute to do. Okay? There's no reason why this isn't done on scene. Longest thing it takes to be put a tourniquet on, we're talking 1 to 2 minutes on scene. You have 10 minutes. Okay? So we'd rather put a tourniquet on instead of messing that up for 10 minutes on the way to the hospital, falling around the truck, and then don't get it done. Right? So now we go head to toe. Jake, you mind laying down? Kind of head to toe. One of the things, the other reason I like this, I said, is it literally works head to toe. If you start at the head, when in the truck and I do my reassessment, I'm literally just going to sweep the person head to toe. So always make sure that your secondary assessment, you're actually touching the person because there can be blood that you're not seeing that's going somewhere, and then you have to expose the person so you can see them. So you should be removing clothing and checking their body. Obviously, depending on how bad the trauma is how much we expose and how much hands-on we're getting if it's not something obvious. But this person was thrown from a vehicle and they're unconscious, my hands or my eyeballs should touch everything. They have to check for everything, right? The big thing with your gloves is to sweep the person and look, really get hands on them, and then look at your gloves and see if there's blood that you're not seeing, especially when you're sweeping the back. When you're moving the person to the cot, it's the time to check their back. So if you move them with the mega mover and you pull them over real quick, you can sweep their whole back and look really quickly and see if you have blood on your gloves. If you're police officer people or some cool fire departments that wear black gloves, you cannot see blood on black gloves. Don't ever wear black gloves. It's why we have white gloves, so you can see blood on them. They look cool and they're tactical, but they're worthless. You can't see anything on them. Okay, so that's why we wear white gloves. Okay, so we're checking it all. So I'm gonna check him head to toe. I'm looking for massive hemorrhage. If I already looked and he had a huge 2x4 in his thigh, I know it's there. I don't need to go find it, but I do need to recheck it. So I get to that and I recheck the tourniquet. Okay, you can get it now, bud. Thank you. So I recheck my tourniquet and I make sure that it was applied properly and I make sure the bleeding was completely stopped. If it's not completely stopped, then I retighten the tourniquet. If that doesn't work, then I put a second tourniquet on. If that doesn't work, then I'm gonna pack the wound and put a direct pressure bandage on. I'm gonna do that anyway. I'm gonna at least put a direct pressure bandage on top of it, right? But I make sure that bleeding is stopped, okay? Next, I go to Airway, okay? So the reason we spend so much time on the M and let all this other stuff wait is because 70% of people that die in priority 1 trauma is bleeding. Because despite 40, 50 years of PHTLS and all of different things, we never got very good at stopping bleeding because people are in too big of a hurry. You cannot outrun bleeding. So from right here to St. John's, Tulsa would be the closest trauma center. It's about 19 to 20 minutes from right here. You'll bleed to death in that amount of time. You cannot outrun trauma. It is impossible. So we have to stop it, which is why we have the tourniquets, why we have the cook hot, all the extra stuff. Next is Airway, so we go to that. And if that person we talked about, we adjusted their airway, now we need to definitively fix it, which probably means intubating them. If they're blowing snot bubbles or blood bubbles, or they're not maintaining their airway, and when they're unconscious, the person needs to be intubated. But that would happen en route on the way there. Okay. Once you intubate them, you verify that it's good, and then you move to the next step, which is the respirations. Whatever breathing problem that they had that you found, you just addressed, and the definitive fix for that is a ventilator. Right? Person on a BVM for the short term, ventilator for the long term. If it's not that serious, we may just be assisting with the BVM, and then that's how I get my respirations fixed, because I fixed the rib. Right? Circulation next, I recheck that pulse. This is when I get a good set of vital signs, and I find out respirations is real, get a good pulse ox, find out what their blood pressure is on my circulation, what it really is, okay? I also would do the interventions for circulation, which are IVs. In a bad trauma would be 2 of them, right? Do 2 IVs, and if I need to give them saline, start saline to maintain their blood pressure. Don't forget in trauma, we're cool with 90 instead of 100, and we never want to give more than a liter of saline unless we're doing it to prevent cardiac arrest. Like their blood pressure's 50 and we can't get it up. Okay? But we never want to give more than a liter of saline. Saline does not fix circulation. All it does is maintain blood pressure. It does not circulate oxygen, so it doesn't do anything for you. It just keeps your blood pressure up and keeps you out of cardiac arrest. And then head injury and hypothermia. This is the one we always forget. We never really think about. So this is whenever you would do a neuro assessment on somebody, look at their eyeballs, their pupils, check all their head out, see if they're injured. If they have a blood pressure that's super high, that may lead you to this. They may have something going on with their head. Look at that, and we deal with hypothermia. Okay? Don't create hypothermia with your 3 liters of saline on the way to the hospital like we used to do all the time, and it makes this easier. But the next is, you just took this person that lost a good chunk or a good amount of blood and was in the environment in some way, out exposed to the environment in some way. Now, I know we've all experienced this, been like really sweaty or like swimming at the pool. You're like, dude, it's 90 out here and I'm shivering. It's just because your body's exposed and you're exposed to the elements, so you get cold. So you really get cold when your body loses its ability to regulate its temperature because it had a head injury where it lost a lot of blood. So remember to cover that person back up that you have trauma naked on your cot. Okay? If it's really cold outside, like in the winter right now, use the heat packs that we have. Put them in their armpits, put them in their groin, and help them heat up. Every temperature closer to normal that you can keep them, their survival rate goes dramatically up, even just on a quick ball. And that's it. Any questions about this algorithm right here? Mark's pretty straightforward. It's a lot easier than the others, and it addresses everything in the most order. When they implemented this, kind of cool history of this, this used to be the killer overseas. Back when I was in the military, when this first came out, they started talking about this. This number was definitively true. 70% of the time, this is what people will kill from. Now, because of using March, using tourniquets so well overseas, massive bleeding is now number 3 on the list. The number 1 killer now is tension pneumothorax, which is part of respirations. The number 1 killer that's preventable is tension pneumo. I think I spelled it wrong, but it's tension pneumo. Right? They're so good at the first two, or they're so good at bleeding now and stopping it that it moved down the list, and people rarely bleed out anymore. Now tension pneumo has moved up. Tension pneumo is still pretty rare, but it's killing people more than because the tourniquets work so well. But because it takes time for change, takes time for us to get on board, we haven't seen that definitively happen in the civilian world yet, because we haven't completely bought into this yet, but we're getting there. But it's kind of a cool statistic. Anything else? Any questions?